going to start off now mixing some sky colours. So this is Phthalo blue. Just rinsing my brush there. I'm going to wet the sky area with my size 8 round mop brush. Just down to those hills, down to the horizon. I'm just loading my brush with the blue and painting wet into wet there, adding a touch more blue and painting this a little bit more damp into wet to make it darker at the top of the sky, and just working my way down, rinsing my brush, just diluting that paint, and as I go towards the horizon the colour will get lighter, so it'll look a little bit further away, and also the clouds get smaller, as you can see there, and it just creates the illusion of depth. So I'm mixing up here some yellow ochre, little puddle there, and I'm going to paint that sort of in the foreground and middle ground, wet on dry, adding a touch of Quinacridone gold and painting that wet on dry right at the bottom, adding a pinch of Indian red, which is quite creamy, damp into wet, and I'm tilting to allow the paint to run naturally there. And what I'm doing now is I am mixing up a little bit of ultramarine with a pinch of alizarin crimson, and I'm painting the sort of distant hills there. You notice I took the excess paint off on my paper towel to control the paint on my brush so it doesn't run too quickly. And I'm going to sprinkle some salt onto the damp painting. What I'm doing now is I'm mixing up a little bit of ultramarine and the Indian red. You could use burnt sienna. And I'm just going to paint a little bit more onto that distant hill there, just to make it a little bit darker, damp into damp with my size 4 round brush. Getting a little bit more of that yellow ochre mixed with the ultramarine. I'm just adding it at the bottom of the hills there. Just going to add some more of the yellow ochre and just sort of smooth out that edge there, working damp into damp with the size 4 round brush. So a really simple landscape. So on to my next landscape. I'm having the horizon line just a little bit higher here. A little bit more information, a few more trees, etc. And some sort of detail in the middle ground and foreground. So I'm wetting the sky again. So I'm going to do a sky wet into wet with the size 8 mop brush. So spend some time doing that to allow the paper to be nice and damp and it doesn't dry too quickly. So mixing up here a little bit of burnt sienna and some ultramarine, about 50-50. And I'm just going to paint sort of a kind of a stormy sky, wet into wet there, leaving some gaps for the clouds. So keep it really, really simple. I'm now mixing up some more ultramarine and just painting that at the top just to make it a little bit darker and a little bit cooler. And a bit more stormier as well, dropping in a little bit more ultramarine wet into wet with the size 8 brush. Getting a pinch of the alizarin crimson and a touch of the yellow ochre. So it's a lovely natural looking colour. And I'm painting that wet on dry. Getting a touch of the Quinacridone gold, pushing that into that colour, wet into wet. This is all from my imagination. Mixing up some sap green there with the ultramarine and burnt sienna and painting that wet into wet there in the foreground. Mixing up some Undersea green, but you could use Phthalo blue mixed with Quinacridone gold, and I'm just painting that wet into wet at the top of those grasses, a little bit more of the sap green mixed with the ultramarine, so it's quite creamy, and just painting some distant trees there, wet into wet, and a little bit of that darker green in the foreground. I've mixed up here the ultramarine with a little bit more of the sap green and a pinch of the Jane's grey, and I'm painting this sort of damp into wet with my size 4 round brush. I'm just mixing up some more ultramarine, slightly creamier, and painting it damp into damp there with the size 8 brush. Bigger mark, stronger colour, so it looks nearer to us, and adding a little bit that in the middle of the sky, damp into wet there. Adding a touch more of the ultramarine mixed with Quinacridone gold in the foreground, and now using my plastic card not only to scratch into the wet surface there, but also to lift off the paint as well, which is what I'm doing here. Make sure the paint is damp and not too wet, otherwise it won't work so well. And remember, if you scratch into the surface, it is permanent. So I'm sprinkling some more salt there, and what that will do, it'll absorb the paint to create some lovely light textures later. What I'm doing now is I'm not going to do any drawing. I'm just going to wet the paper right down to the bottom using the size 8 brush. I've actually got a very tiny little bit of buff titanium there, very watered down. You could use a very watered down raw sienna. This is a little bit of Hansa yellow light mixed with the buff titanium. You could use this on its own. Touch of the Quinacridone gold now, all wet into wet, and a little bit of burnt sienna right at the top. So you've got a really kind of almost like a sunset here. I'm painting Indian red damp into damp at the top there, and I'm tilting to allow the paint to blend into the colours below. Using a touch more of that Indian red damp into wet, using the tip of my brush to create a kind of a horizon line there. Using the size 4 brush to add some more of the Indian red damp into damp in the sky to create some more clouds. I've mixed up some grey with the Indian red there, painting a little bit more damp into damp at the top there just to create some darker clouds and to create depth. Just using a little bit of burnt sienna now, wet into wet for the more distant clouds. Mixing up here ultramarine mixed with some burnt sienna and a pinch of grey. And I'm painting sort of damp into damp here, the foreground. The colour wasn't quite dark enough, so I'm using some of the phthalo blue mixed with a little bit of that Indian red. It makes a really much stronger colour. I want it to come forward. So I've added a pinch of the burnt sienna as well to warm things up. And here's a close-up. This is all damp into wet really, and I'm sort of painting grasses and they almost look like little wildflowers there. So just painting sort of distant land here as well. They could be trees, and it's all kind of wet into wet here. Using my plastic card to sort of pull up some of that wet paint to create some thinner foliage there in the foreground. Mixing up a darker green here using the Undersea green with some ultramarine. And just painting pretty much wet on dry now in this middle painting using my size 4 round brush. Excuse the back of my hand there. This creates darker grasses and pulls that foreground forward, adding some darks along the horizon there, a little bit of interest. And doing the same on this left hand painting here, a few little darks and details, pretty much wet on dry here along the horizon and in the foreground with my size 4 brush. I think it's a good time now to allow the paintings to dry naturally. As you can see there, the salts work quite nicely in places. I'm just painting wet on dry there using ultramarine burnt sienna and softening it with a clean damp brush. Just to soften it, to push it back a little bit. Create some interest but not too much that comes forward and makes the painting look flat. And just adding a few little darks and details here in the foreground to sort of bring that forward to make it look more 3D. And little marks like this can make such a difference. A few more little brush strokes here and there in the foreground of the centre painting, a few more darks along the horizon just to add a little bit of information. It can be quite abstract. So here are the finished paintings. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube and get access to my exclusive tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Just click Patreon. You'll be able to get access to my downloadable outline sketches, ad-free content, and you can cancel anytime. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.